The world above was still wrapped in silence, the kind of silence that only exists in the depths of the night. But down below, in a narrow attic room, time stirred against its will. The year was 1885, and the house at this hour was a frozen monument to comfort. Its wealthy occupants cocooned in feather beds behind heavy curtains, unaware of the life that stirred beneath their feet. In the attic, the darkness was absolute, broken only by the faintest glow of moonlight sneaking through a crack in the ill-fitted window. 3 kitchen maids lay in restless stillness, atop straw mattresses, their bodies curled against the cold that crept in through the thin, slanted walls. The sound came first, a distant church bell, its chime muffled by the layers of London. Dawn, fog. 1, 2, 3, 4. The bell marked the hour, but to Mary it marked something else entirely. Her eyes opened, though the darkness made it pointless. She blinked once, twice, and stared into the void. She lay there, unmoving, limbs still heavy with exhaustion. The cold air pressed against her cheeks, seeping through the coarse wool blanket pulled tightly to her chin. Her breath was shallow, her body unwilling to obey the demands of the day ahead. But this moment, this fleeting, fragile moment, was hers. For 30 seconds, she simply existed. She wasn't Mary, the kitchen maid. She wasn't a cog in the relentless machinery of the household. She was simply a girl, lying still, stealing a sliver of time, but wasn't owed to anyone else. It was the only theft she would commit all day, and she knew it. Her eyes adjusted to the darkness, tracing the faint outlines of the rafters above her head. She could smell the faint remnants of yesterday's coal smoke, trapped high in the attic where the air never seemed to fully clear. The scent was familiar, almost comforting, though it carried the weight of constant labor. The cold began to creep further, slipping under the blanket, biting at her fingers and toes. The straw mattress beneath her crackled softly as she shifted her weight. On the other side of the room, one of the other maids stirred, though she didn't wake. Mary closed her eyes for a moment longer, clutching the last seconds of stillness. She had learned long ago that these moments, though brief, were essential. Once her feet touched the floor, the day would no longer belong to her. 18 hours stretched ahead, a carefully choreographed performance where every movement had to be precise, every task executed flawlessly. There was no room for mistakes, no tolerance for forgetting the invisible rules that govern this world. She inhaled deeply, her breath leaving her lips in a faint, visible puff. The attic wasn't just cold, it was freezing. Her blanket, though pulled tightly around her shoulders, did little to shield her from the night air that seemed to seep through every corner of the house. Still, she lingered in that stolen moment, knowing it would be gone too soon. And then she moved slowly, reluctantly. She pulled the blanket away, exposing her skin to the icy air. Her legs swung over the edge of the mattress, her bare feet hovering above the floor for a second longer than necessary. She braced herself, knowing what was coming, and then, with the faintest of sighs, she let her toes press against the wooden floorboards. The chill shot up her legs, sharp and unforgiving. It wasn't the kind of cold that could be ignored. It was the kind that settled into your bones, making itself a part of you. But she didn't hesitate. Her day had begun. And with that touch of cold wood against bare skin, the machinery of the house began to turn. The attic remained cloaked in darkness, the stillness broken only by the faint creak of a shifting mattress. Mary moved slowly, careful not to disturb the other maids. Dressing was not a luxury or a moment of self-expression. It was a ritual, a transformation, a shedding of self. Each piece of clothing she slipped on was a layer of her identity being stripped away, replaced by the uniform of servitude. The act was silent, deliberate, and practiced, each movement precise, each step ingrained in her from years of repetition. Her first layer was the chemise, its fabric rough against her skin. It had been worn for 3 days now, and the faint scent of sweat and lye soap lingered. She pulled it over her head with practiced ease, the hem brushing against her knees as she adjusted it into place. The chemise was not hers, though it touched her most intimately. It belonged to the household, as did every piece of clothing she wore. If she were dismissed, she would leave with nothing but the clothes she had arrived in years ago. Next came the stays. She wrapped the stiff corset around her torso, her fingers working in near total darkness to fasten the busk in the front. The stays were not meant to flatter or accentuate, but to confine. They shaped her into the silhouette of a servant, upright, proper, restrained, tight enough to maintain decorum, yet loose enough to allow her to bend and scrub floors without fainting. She exhaled sharply as she adjusted the laces, her breath visible in the cold attic air. Her wool stockings came next, each one carefully pulled over feet that were already beginning to ache from the thought of the long day ahead. She fumbled briefly at the knee, where the fabric had been darned again and again. Every stitch told a story of frugality and necessity, of how even the smallest tear could not be ignored. She secured the stockings with garters, the elastic biting into her skin. Finally the dress. Plain, dark, and unadorned, its high collar reached her neck, its long sleeves covered her arms. It was designed to erase her, to hide any trace of femininity, personality, or individuality. She buttoned it one small, deliberate fastening at a time, each button a step closer to invisibility. By the time the last button reached her throat, she was no longer Mary, not in the sense that mattered. She was the kitchen maid, a nameless, faceless figure in the household's machinery. A faint sound reached her ears, cutting through the silence. From below, 3 floors down, a door opened. Its creak echoed upward, and with it came the weight of the day. The house was stirring. The kitchen was waking, and Mary, now fully dressed, rose to meet it. The attic air clung to Mary's skin as she slipped silently out of the room, careful to avoid the creak of the loose floorboard near the door. The house around her remained steeped in pre-dawn quiet, its stillness heavy and unbroken. But as she stepped into the narrow servants' corridor, the silence seemed to shift. These passageways, hidden behind the grandeur of the main house, were not meant to be seen by the family. They were designed for movement without presence, for people who worked without being noticed. The air here was colder, the walls closer, the space tight and confining, as though the house itself conspired to remind her of her place. She began her descent down the back staircase, her hand instinctively gripping the wooden banister. It was smooth, polished not by care but by the passage of countless hands over countless years. Her feet moved automatically, each step familiar, each creak of the stairs a sound she had heard thousands of times before. How many mornings had she made this descent? 2003. She had stopped counting long ago. The staircase twisted sharply, its corners dark and unlit, the faint light from the windowless corridor above fading behind her. The temperature dropped with every step, the chill of the basement creeping up to meet her sharp and damp against her skin. These stairs, these hallways were part of a world the family above would never know. The walls themselves betrayed their existence, doors disguised as panels, corridors built into the very bones of the house, staircases hidden from the grand halls and sweeping foyers. It was intentional, all of it. The architects of these homes were instructed to design separation, to create a system where the servants moved like ghosts, unseen and unheard. The family would glide through their day, moving from room to room, while all around them, behind walls and beneath floors, another world worked invisibly to sustain their comfort. Mary's hand lingered on the banister, her fingertips tracing the grooves worn by so many others. There was a strange comfort in knowing she wasn't alone. The wood held the memory of every maid who had walked these stairs before her, every set of tired feet that had descended into the same cold, the same darkness. This was her path now, as it had been theirs, a path that belonged to the unseen. At the bottom of the stairs she paused. The cold air of the corridor gave way to something else, a faint warmth radiating from the kitchen just beyond the door. She reached for the handle and pushed it open. The sudden heat hit her first, a wave of warmth that clashed with the chill she had just left. Light flooded her vision, flickering and uneven, cast by the flames of the kitchen range. The noise rushed in next, the clatter of pots, the hiss of boiling water, the crackle of firewood. The kitchen, already alive with fire and purpose, swallowed her whole. The kitchen was a world unto itself, hidden beneath the grand rooms above. It was not a single space, but a labyrinth of interconnected chambers, each with its own purpose. The scullery, where water pooled endlessly in deep stone sinks. The pantry, lined with shelves that groaned under the weight of jars, sacks and tins. The larder, colder than the rest, its air filled with the faint metallic tang of stored meat. And tucked into a corner, the cook's quarters, a sanctum that no maid dared enter without permission. At its centre, like the beating heart of this subterranean domain, stood the massive cast iron range. Its fire had been lit hours earlier by the scullery maid who had risen long before Mary. Flames flickered behind its iron grate, casting shadows that danced across the stone walls. Mary stepped into the room and felt the heat immediately. It radiated from the range, relentless and consuming, but the warmth didn't reach the far corners of the kitchen. There, near the stone floor and damp walls, the cold lingered stubbornly, a reminder of the night that still clung to the house. The contrast was striking. One corner of the room sweltering, the other biting with the chill of early dawn. Mary moved quickly, her breath still visible in the colder pockets of the room. Her first task was always the same, checking the range. She knelt beside it, opening the heavy iron door to peer inside. The flames crackled hungrily, and she reached for the poker, adjusting the coals until the heat balanced just right. The scullery maid had done her part, but it was Mary's responsibility to ensure the range was ready for the demands of the day ahead. Next, she turned to the kettles, hauling them to the range to fill with water. Steam began to rise almost immediately, curling upward in ghostly tendrils. From there, she made her way to the coal cellar. The door creaked as she opened it, revealing a dark, cavernous space filled with the sharp, acrid smell of coal dust. She hefted a basket, heavy even when empty, and began the back-breaking work of filling it. Each shovel of coal added weight until the basket strained against her grip. 30 pounds 40. By the time she carried it back to the kitchen, her arms burned and her breath came in short gasps. She repeated the process twice more. Over 100 pounds of coal moved before the day had truly begun. And then, as she wiped her hands on her apron, she heard it, footsteps on the stairs. Heavy, deliberate, measured. The cook was descending, and with her arrival, the kitchen seemed to hold its breath. The brief peace of the early hour was over. The real work was about to begin. The sound of Mrs. Bridges' footsteps grew louder, each deliberate tread resonating through the narrow stairwell. In her wake came a shift in the very air of the kitchen. Moments before, the space had been alive but subdued, its workers moving quietly through the softened rhythms of the early morning. Now, as she entered, the atmosphere sharpened. The fire roared a little louder, the clinking of kettles seemed to pause mid-motion, and every servant's posture straightened instinctively. Mrs. Bridges had arrived. Mrs. Bridges wasn't her real name. It didn't matter if she had been born a Smith, a Jones, or something else entirely. In households like this, cooks were often bestowed the honorary title of Mrs., regardless of marital status. It was a mark of their authority, a subtle but undeniable acknowledgement that they were the queens of their domain. And make no mistake, the kitchen was Mrs. Bridges' kingdom. She answered only to the housekeeper and the mistress of the house, and even they stepped lightly when dealing with her. She swept into the room, her presence commanding as much as her keys, which clinked softly at her waist as she moved. They hung from a thick cord, a visible reminder of her authority. Those keys unlocked the pantry, the larder, the spice cupboard. Every corner of the kitchen's bounty was under her control. Her cameo brooch, pinned securely to her collar, gleamed faintly in the firelight, a small but deliberate signal of her rank. Mrs. Bridges wasn't flamboyant, but she knew how to make her position unmistakable. Her first task was always inspection. She began with the range, crouching slightly to peer into its fiery depths. The scullery maid had done well. The coals were glowing evenly, the heat balanced. A slight nod of approval from Mrs. Bridges was the only reward. She moved on, her eyes scanning the long wooden work table. The surfaces gleamed, scrubbed clean to her exacting standards. A single crumb or streak of grease would have drawn her ire, but today it seemed the staff had avoided her wrath. For now, her gaze landed on Mary next. Mary stood perfectly still, her hands clasped in front of her, her eyes lowered. The weight of Mrs. Bridges' scrutiny was something every maid feared. A wrinkle in her apron, a stray hair slipping loose from her tightly pinned bun, even the faintest shadow of dirt under her fingernails. Any of these might invite a sharp word or a heavy sigh of disapproval. Mary didn't dare move. She had learned long ago that the best way to survive this moment was to become as invisible as possible. Satisfied, Mrs. Bridges straightened and began issuing orders. Her voice was low but firm, each word a command that brooked no argument. The kettles must be boiling before the mistress wakes. The bread for luncheon needs proving by 9, and see to the vegetables in the pantry, they won't peel themselves. With 3 terse instructions, the morning's choreography began. Each maid moved to her station, every task assigned with precision. Mrs. Bridges' work had only just begun, but already her kingdom below stairs was in motion. In this world, the cook wielded more power than most men would ever know. She controlled the food budgets, dictated the flow of the kitchen, and held the futures of her staff in her hands. A word from her could see a maid promoted or dismissed, and she wore that power unapologetically, visibly, like the keys at her waist. Here, in this hidden world of labour and fire, Mrs. Bridges reigned supreme. With her orders given, she stepped back, watching as her staff fell into their roles. The day was no longer theirs. Every hour, every minute now served the household above. But below, the machinery of the kitchen hummed to life. And so, with the faintest of nods, Mrs. Bridges turned her attention to the next task, and the morning truly began. Mary stepped into the scullery, a narrow, damp room that felt colder than the kitchen itself. The stone walls absorbed the chill of early morning, and the air was thick with the scent of soap and lingering steam. There was no running hot water here, not in this house, nor in many others of the time. Every drop of warmth had to be earned, heated by the kitchen's fire, and carried carefully in heavy kettles down the steep steps. The work was slow, deliberate, and exhausting. Before her stood the 3 large stone basins, the heart of the washing ritual. The first basin was filled with soapy water, thick and murky from the residue of countless meals. Next came the rinse basin, filled with clearer water to wash away suds and grime. The last basin was reserved for scalding, water heated to nearly boiling, used to sterilize and dry the dishes. Mary's hands moved in a steady rhythm, dipping plates first into the washing basin, scrubbing away stains and grease with a stiff brush, then dipping them quickly into the rinse, and finally into the scalding water. The shock of temperature changes was constant, her skin raw and numb by midday. The sheer volume of dishes was staggering. A formal dinner for 12 people could generate over 200 individual pieces. Plates, bowls, cups, saucers, serving dishes, and silverware. Each had to be handled with care. The delicate china bore patterns that could never be replicated once broken. Crystal glasses, clear and fragile, showed every fingerprint, demanding constant polishing. Copper pots required separate cleaning, scrubbed with salt and vinegar to restore their shine without damaging the metal. Every dish was a gamble. Any breakage meant a deduction from her meagre wages. One careless slip could cost her a day's pay, or worse. Mary bent and stretched over the stone sinks, her back aching from the constant motion. Her fingers, pruned and cracked, moved mechanically, each plate a small victory against exhaustion. She knew the routine well, yet every morning felt like the first time, her hands holding a month's salary in fragile ceramic and shimmering glass. The scullery was a world apart, a relentless battle against dirt and wear, where the physical toll was matched only by the constant pressure to avoid mistakes. Steam rose in thin, curling wisps, mingling with the cold air to form a mist that blurred the edges of the room. The scullery was both sanctuary and prison, a place where time seemed to stretch and compress, measured in soapy water and broken dishes. As the last breakfast plate was scrubbed clean and set aside to dry, a sharp, insistent sound cut through the quiet. From somewhere in the walls, a bell jangled, shrill, demanding, immediate. The family was stirring, and with them, the real performance would begin. Before the family above stirred from their beds, the servants had already gathered for their own morning meal. It was a simple affair, starkly different from the elaborate breakfasts prepared for the household's masters. The kitchen maids ate quickly, often standing or perched on low stools near the hearth. The food was functional, designed to fuel the long hours ahead rather than to delight the senses. Porridge was the staple, thick, warm, and cooked in enormous iron pots that filled the kitchen with a comforting, earthy aroma. It was rarely sweetened, sometimes salted, and occasionally dotted with a small pat of dripping or a spoonful of treacle when the household was feeling generous. Alongside the porridge, there was bread. Often it was yesterday's bread, salvaged from the family table, slightly stale but never wasted. Butter, chalky and pale, was spread thinly, rationed carefully to ensure it lasted. Tea was poured into chipped cups, its bitterness softened by a splash of milk, warming cold hands and waking tired minds. In some households there might be bacon or eggs, but these were treats reserved for special occasions, or the more fortunate servants. Servants ate in shifts, a rotating schedule that ensured someone was always present in the kitchen, ready to respond should the family call. The cook ate separately from the kitchen maids, maintaining the strict social hierarchy even at the simplest meal. The cook's portion was larger, her seat more comfortable, her presence commanding respect. For the maids, breakfast was hurried, silent, and efficient. There was no time for leisure or conversation. In some strict households, talking was forbidden during meals except to request items be passed. Silence was a rule, an expectation, a way to remain unseen even while eating. Mary's portion was modest but sufficient. The porridge filled her stomach, the bread gave her energy, and the tea chased away the last vestiges of sleep. She ate quickly, knowing that soon the kitchen would erupt into activity. The food was not a pleasure but a necessity, a fuel for the endless tasks that awaited her. There was no indulgence here, only the quiet understanding that every bite was part of the day's survival. They fed the servants before the family woke, not out of kindness, but out of necessity. Hungry servants worked slower, and speed was everything in a house that ran on invisible labour. This breakfast was the first act in a day measured not by clocks but by tasks completed, by demands met, and by the silence kept. As Mary finished her last bite, the clock struck 6, heavy, resonant chimes that echoed through the house. The sound marked more than time, it signalled the start of the family's breakfast preparations. The quiet in the kitchen shifted, anticipation thickening the air. The day above was waking, and with it, the kitchen's true performance was about to begin. The servants' breakfast had been functional, unremarkable, and fleeting, but the family's breakfast was an entirely different matter, an elaborate production that demanded precision, timing, and an orchestra of labour below stairs. As the clock struck 6, the kitchen transformed into a hive of activity, each person moving with purpose under the watchful eye of Mrs. Bridges. Her voice cut through the air, issuing instructions as the first pans were placed on the roaring range. The menu was as grand as it was demanding. Porridge or kedgeree, delicately spiced rice with flaked fish, was prepared in wide, steaming pots. Eggs were cooked to order, soft, boiled, scrambled, or poached, each requiring careful attention to ensure they were served just right. Thick, cut bacon sizzled in cast iron pans, the edges curling to a perfect crisp. Sausages browned next to kidneys, their rich aroma mingling with the salty tang of kippers laid over flames. Toast was made not with the ease of a modern toaster, but by holding slices of bread on long forks before the open fire, turning them carefully to avoid scorching. The kitchen was alive with sound, the hiss of frying fat, the clatter of utensils, the rhythmic scraping of Mary's knife as she spread butter on freshly toasted bread. Her hands moved quickly, almost automatically, as she worked through her tasks. Tea was brewed with ceremony, leaves measured precisely, steeped to perfection, and strained into delicate pots. Coffee, strong and fragrant, bubbled on the range. Each item had its place, and every dish required perfect timing. Bacon that sat too long would harden, toast left unattended would cool, eggs cooked even seconds too long would be deemed unacceptable. For the family above, breakfast was the largest meal of the day. It was a display of abundance, even if they dined alone. In many grand houses, breakfast was not a communal affair. Trays were prepared for individual bedrooms, laden with porcelain plates, silver cutlery, and covered dishes to keep the food hot. This meant multiple trips up and down the servants' staircase, balancing trays heavy with dishes, pouring tea at the last moment to ensure it was still steaming. The labor was invisible by design. A single breakfast for one person required 3 people below stairs working for nearly 90 minutes. And yet, if the toast arrived cold or the eggs were not perfectly set, the dissatisfaction would fall heavily on Mary, on the cook, on anyone caught in the chain of blame. As the trays were carefully assembled and loaded, the kitchen fell briefly silent, each worker focused on the final details. The food was hot, the presentation perfect, but now came the hardest part, the delivery itself. The trays were perfect, the food was hot, and now came the part that required absolute silence and absolute invisibility, the delivery. The breakfast trays were ready, each one a carefully balanced arrangement of porcelain, silver, and steaming dishes. Mary stepped back as the housemaid. A young woman named Clara lifted one of the trays and prepared for her journey upstairs. Mary rarely carried trays herself, that was not her role. But she knew the unspoken rules that Clara would follow as she ascended to the world above. A world that servants were meant to serve but never truly inhabit. The rules of movement in a Victorian household were not written down, yet every servant knew them as instinctively as breathing. The first and most important, avoid being seen. Servants were expected to exist as silent ghosts, moving through the house without disturbing the family's carefully curated peace. Back staircases were their domain, narrow and steep, hidden behind the grandeur of the main halls. These staircases were designed for efficiency, not elegance, their treads worn smooth by decades of hurried, unseen footsteps. If a servant absolutely had to pass through a family space, there was a strict protocol to follow. Never speak unless spoken to. Never make eye contact. Keep your head slightly bowed and your movements swift but silent. If you encountered a member of the family unexpectedly, you stepped aside, pressing yourself against the wall, eyes averted until they passed. To do otherwise was unthinkable, a breach of the delicate, invisible barrier that separated the world above from the world below. Even the architecture of the house conspired to enforce these rules. Doors were designed to swing silently, their hinges oiled regularly to avoid the faintest creak. Servant bells were positioned discreetly, allowing commands to be issued without verbal interaction. Rooms often had multiple entrances, one for the family, one for the staff, so that servants could enter, perform their duties, and leave without disrupting the household's rhythm. It was an intricate dance, one that required constant awareness and precision. The family, for their part, rarely noticed the servants at all. This was by design. They did not know Mary as Mary or Clara as Clara. To them, she was the kitchen maid, an interchangeable role filled by countless women before her and countless more to come. Faces were irrelevant. Positions were what mattered. A servant might spend years in a household, witnessing the most intimate moments of the family's life, yet remain entirely unseen, her humanity eclipsed by her function. This invisibility carried a strange psychological weight. To be ever present yet never acknowledged, to hear everything and say nothing, to see the family laugh, argue, and cry while remaining as unnoticed as the wallpaper. It was a peculiar existence. Mary had learned long ago to suppress the sting of it. She could stand 3 feet away from the master, holding his breakfast tray, and he would not see her, not because she was skilled at hiding, but because he was skilled at not seeing. Clara moved up the stairs now, her steps careful and measured, the tray balanced perfectly in her hands. Mary watched her go, knowing how many small decisions and adjustments Clara would make to ensure the food arrived as expected. The eggs still warm, the toast still crisp, the tea still steaming. If anything was amiss, the blame would ripple down the chain of command, landing somewhere below stairs. But here, below stairs, life was different. The servants weren't ghosts. They had names, faces, and histories. They laughed, argued, and formed alliances. Their social structure was as rigid as the one above them, but it was a world where everyone was visible and everyone mattered, if only to each other. And so, while Clara disappeared into the silent world of upstairs, Mary turned back to the warmth of the kitchen, where the real dynamics of servant life were about to unfold. The servants' hall was the heart of life below stairs, a space where the unseen machinery of the household paused briefly to sustain itself. It was a room of long shadows and low ceilings, warmed by the lingering heat of the kitchen, but never fully comfortable. A long wooden table dominated the room, its surface worn smooth by years of use. Chairs were placed around it with meticulous precision, not by chance but by rank. Here, even in their moments of rest, the hierarchy of the household was meticulously maintained. At the upper end of the table sat the butler and the housekeeper, the undisputed rulers of the servants' domain. To their left and right, the upper servants took their places, the cook, the lady's maid, the valet. Their seats were slightly more comfortable, their portions slightly larger, their authority visible in every detail of the arrangement. At the lower end of the table sat the housemaids, kitchen maids, scullery maids, and boot boys crammed into the remaining space. The divide between the two ends was more than physical. It was psychological, an unspoken reminder of one's place in the hierarchy. Meals in the servants' hall were as formal as they were anywhere else in the household. The butler and housekeeper began their meal first, a silent signal that the others could follow. Conversation, when permitted, was subdued and deferential. Lower servants rarely spoke unless addressed by those of higher rank. Even laughter, if it occurred, was muted, restrained by the invisible but palpable rules of decorum. When the upper servants finished eating, their plates were cleared, and only then could the lower servants begin their meal in earnest. It was a system of precedence mirrored in every corner of the house. This hierarchy, though imposed from above, was also perpetuated by the servants themselves. Status mattered deeply in a world where material possessions were few and futures uncertain. A lady's maid might wear the cast-off silk dresses of her mistress, yet she carried herself with a pride that often bordered on disdain for those below her. To a kitchen maid, she might seem like a different species entirely, her hands unsoiled by the physical labor of scrubbing floors or peeling potatoes. And yet both women accepted their respective places in this rigid structure, believing it to be the natural order of the world. Every action in the hall was coded with meaning. The butler poured the first cup of tea, a small but unmistakable symbol of his authority. Plates were cleared by the footman, whose work required a blend of discretion and efficiency. The cook rarely rose from her chair, her position granting her the privilege of being served. For those lower in rank, tasks like pouring tea or clearing plates were opportunities to display respect, or occasionally subtle rebellion. A clumsy hand or a delayed response might seem accidental, but among the servants such gestures rarely went unnoticed. The servants' hall was, in many ways, a mirror of the household it served. The same rules of superiority and deference that governed the family upstairs were replicated here, though in different forms. The distinctions between master and servant were stark, but within the servants' quarters there existed a parallel world of power, status, and rivalry. It was a society within a society, a miniature kingdom that functioned on its own rigid rules. Mary, as a kitchen maid, would rarely sit in this hall. Her meals were taken standing in the kitchen, a quick and practical affair. The servants' hall was reserved for those with higher status, a reminder of her place at the very bottom of this carefully constructed world. And so, as the last fork from the family's breakfast was placed on the tray upstairs, Mary's next task began. There was no pause, no respite. For someone in her position, the day moved forward without hesitation. The echoes of breakfast faded as the family retreated to their private rooms, leaving behind a battlefield of crumbs, stains, and used silver. The trays were carried back down the servants' staircase, the clinking of dishes signaling the start of yet another round of invisible labor. Mary stood ready in the kitchen, her sleeves rolled up, her hands already reaching for the first stack of plates. Breakfast was over upstairs, but for those below stairs it had only just begun. The plates arrived smeared with remnants of the meal, streaks of yolk, congealed butter, a crust of toast left uneaten. Silver spoons rested in half-empty cups of cold tea, their rims stained brown. Napkins, creased and spotted, were bundled into the laundry bin. Mary's first task was to scrape the plates clean. Each one was held over a wooden bucket, its contents carefully sorted. Scraps of meat and bread went into one bucket. They would be sent to a local pig farmer. Vegetable peels and eggshells were set aside for compost. The rest, uneaten and unusable, was discarded, though the act of discarding food always felt like a quiet betrayal. In some households, servants were allowed to eat leftovers from the family's table: cold bacon, uneaten slices of ham, a small corner of pudding that hadn't been touched, but not here. In this house, any food returning to the kitchen was considered the property of the family, and to take even a crumb was theft. Mary scraped half a sausage into the bucket, her stomach twisting as the smell of it lingered in the air. She hadn't eaten much herself, just porridge and bread, and the sight of wasted food stirred emotions she had learned to suppress. Hunger was a constant companion, but so was discipline. She scraped and sorted, forcing herself not to think about it. Once the plates were cleared, the washing began. The scullery maid handled most of it, but Mary assisted where she could. Silver was separated from china, each requiring a different touch. The delicate teacups were rinsed and dried with care, while the heavy silver spoons and knives were polished until they gleamed. Copper pans, still warm from the range, were scrubbed with salt and vinegar to remove grease and restore their shine. The kitchen filled with the sound of scrubbing, the splash of water, and the occasional clatter of a dish set too hard on the drying rack. But the work didn't stop with the dishes. The range, blackened by morning fires, required attention. Mary knelt before it, her hands coated in black lead polish as she worked the paste into the iron surface. The polish prevented rust and gave the range its deep, dark sheen, but the task was messy and exhausting. When the range was gleaming again, she moved to the work surfaces, scrubbing them clean of flour, grease, and crumbs. The stone floor was swept, then mopped, the bucket of soapy water growing darker with each rinse. Coal scuttles were refilled, water jugs replenished, every corner of the kitchen reset for the next wave of demands. Time in the kitchen wasn't measured by the clock on the wall, but by the work remaining, and there was always work remaining. Mary didn't glance at the clock as she wrung out the mop for the final time. It didn't matter if it was 8:30 or 8:45. What mattered was that the breakfast cleanup was complete, the kitchen restored to order. As the last dish was put away, Mary straightened her back and wiped her hands on her apron. The clock struck 9, its chimes echoing through the house. 5 hours of work lay behind her. 13 hours remained before she could climb those dark stairs again and sleep. The breakfast dishes were done, the range polished, the floor scrubbed. For the first time that morning, the kitchen was quiet, not silent. There was always the hum of the range, the faint dripping of a tap, the distant clatter of someone moving about upstairs, but quieter, enough that Mary could hear her own thoughts for a moment. She slipped out the back door, her steps soft on the stone floor, and let the crisp morning air meet her. The back step was small, chipped at the edges and damp from the night, its lingering dew. It wasn't a place of comfort, but it was hers for now. Mary lowered herself onto the step, her back aching as she stretched, the stiffness in her shoulders easing slightly. The coal cellar door stood a few feet away, its blackened hinges streaked with dust. She stared at it for a moment, her thoughts drifting not to the next task, but to nothing at all. These moments, stolen and fleeting, were precious, not for the physical rest they provided, though rest was always needed, but for the mental freedom they allowed. For 15 minutes, she was a kitchen maid. She was just Mary. She ran her fingers over the fabric of her apron, feeling the rough texture beneath her fingertips. A small tear had appeared near the pocket, likely from brushing past the coal scuttle earlier. Her hands moved instinctively to mend it, pulling a needle and thread from the small sewing kit she kept tucked in the folds of her dress. The stitch was quick and neat, her fingers working with the precision born of necessity. But as she sewed, her mind wandered. She thought of the village she had left behind, green fields and narrow lanes that seemed so far away now. She had been just 12 when she was sent into service, a child by any measure. There had been too many mouths to feed at home, and her wages, meagre as they were, had gone to her family. They still did. £10 a year didn't stretch far, but it was enough to feed a younger sibling or pay for coal in the winter. She didn't resent them for it. Not exactly. But the loneliness of it all was hard to ignore. Service was an endless state of watchfulness and obedience, a life lived for others. Her thoughts drifted further to things she didn't. She often let herself imagine. What would life have been like if she had stayed in the village, if she had married a farmer or a labourer, raised children of her own? She shook the thought away. It was a luxury she could afford, this imagining of other lives. The cold of the stone step seeped through her dress, pulling her back to the present. She stretched her legs, her boots scuffing against the ground. The minutes were slipping past, and she knew it. These stolen moments always ended too soon, but they were enough to remind her that she was still more than her title, more than the endless tasks that defined her day. She stood, not because anyone called her, but because she knew. The morning's real work was about to begin, and it would not wait for her to be ready. The streets were already alive, bustling with the chaos of morning commerce, as Mary trailed 3 steps behind the cook. The air was thick with competing smells, freshly baked bread mingling with the salty tang of fish, the earthy musk of vegetables piled high on wooden carts, and the sharper metallic scent of raw meat. Vendors called out to passing shoppers, their voices sharp and persistent, each one promoting their wares with promises of freshness and quality. It was marketing day, and the cook moved through the muddy streets as though she owned them, her presence commanding, her stride purposeful. Mary clutched the empty wicker baskets tightly, her head slightly bowed. She didn't speak unless spoken to, her role clear, to carry the weight of the morning's purchases, to follow silently, to be invisible. The cook, by contrast, was anything but. In the market, she was somebody representing the wealth and status of the household she served. Butchers greeted her with respectful nods, fishmongers leaned forward eagerly, and farmers waited patiently as she examined their offerings. To them, she was not just a cook, she was a gatekeeper to the household's resources, and her favour could secure them steady business. At the butcher's stall, the cook negotiated briskly, pointing to slabs of beef and racks of lamb, questioning their freshness, insisting on the best cuts. Her fingers pressed into the meat, testing its firmness, her sharp eyes flicking over the marbling. The butcher, though polite, was clearly wary of her scrutiny. The cook had a reputation to uphold. Any poor quality meat that reached the household table would reflect poorly on her, and she had no intention of risking her standing. A nod of approval, a few coins exchanged, and the first purchase was made. Mary stepped forward, lifting the heavy parcel into her basket, the strain on her arms immediate. The fishmonger's stall came next, its wooden counter slick with water and scales. The cook bent low over the display, her nose wrinkling slightly as she examined the fish. She checked the brightness of their eyes, the sheen of their scales, the firmness of their flesh. The same ritual played out at the vegetable cart, where she squeezed tomatoes, tapped melons, and inspected potatoes for blemishes. Each purchase was deliberate, a decision weighed carefully against the household's budget and the cook's exacting standards. Behind her, Mary's basket grew heavier. The combined weight of meat, fish, and vegetables pressed into her arms and shoulders, but she said nothing. Her hands gripped the wicker tightly, her legs straining as she followed the cook through the crowded streets. She was there, but not there, a shadow trailing behind, performing the physical labour while the cook performed the social one. The journey back to the house was slower, the burden of the baskets making each step more difficult. The cook walked ahead, her head held high, while Mary's muscles ached under the strain. The baskets were heavy on the return journey, but they were heavier with promise. These vegetables, this meat, this fish would become lunch and dinner, and their transformation would consume the next 8 hours. The kitchen hummed with quiet determination as the morning rolled on. Luncheon was not the grand affair that dinner would be, but it was no less demanding. The family expected multiple courses, a hot soup to start, followed by a cold meat or fish dish, bread and cheese, a selection of fresh fruit, and a simple dessert. Each dish, though modest by comparison to the evening meal, required precision and care. The cook's voice carried across the room, issuing instructions with sharp efficiency. Mary obeyed without hesitation, her hands already moving through the first of many tasks. Her morning began with potatoes, 43 of them, to be exact. Each one had to be peeled by hand, the skin removed in long, even strips, leaving no blemish behind. The potatoes would be diced for the soup, their uniformity ensuring they cooked evenly. Mary worked quickly, the blade of her knife flashing as her fingers moved with practiced precision. Perfection wasn't optional, it was survival. A poorly peeled potato wasn't just a mistake, it was a mark against her competence, and failure in the kitchen could cost her the position she relied on to survive. She peeled each one perfectly because the alternative was unthinkable. Once the potatoes were done, there were carrots, leeks, and onions to prepare, each vegetable requiring its own rhythm of cutting and chopping. The heat from the range grew oppressive as the soup pot began to bubble, steam rising in thick, curling wisps that clung to Mary's skin. The work was repetitive, but there was no time to let her mind wander. The cook's eye was always watching, and Mary knew better than to let her pace falter. While Mary worked on the vegetables, the cook focused on the more skilled tasks, preparing the pastry for a savoury pie, seasoning the soup base, and ensuring the sauce for the dessert had just the right balance of sweetness. The division of labour was clear. The cook handled the artistry of the meal, the seasoning, the textures, the presentation. Mary, by contrast, performed the invisible work, the peeling, chopping, stirring, and carrying that made the artistry possible. Her hands moved constantly, the ache in her shoulders and back ignored as the minutes ticked by. Victorian kitchens demanded skill, but they also demanded endurance. There were no electric mixers or modern conveniences to ease the labour. Pastry dough was kneaded by hand, the coolness of the butter judged by touch. Soup was stirred with wooden spoons, its consistency adjusted by instinct rather than measurement. Oven temperatures were guessed at, the heat tested by briefly holding a hand inside or scattering a pinch of flour to see how quickly it browned. Every task required attention, and every mistake carried consequences. The larder was opened, and cold meats were brought out. Ham sliced thin and arranged on china plates, alongside a terrine of potted fish. The bread, baked earlier that week, was sliced into thick, even pieces. The cheese, wrapped in muslin, was unwrapped and placed carefully on a wooden board. Mary set each item out with care, her hands moving swiftly but deliberately. The cook inspected everything as it came together, her approval silent but understood. As the soup simmered, the pastry baked, and the cold meats rested on their plates, the clock marched toward 1 o'clock. Everything had to be ready precisely when the family wanted it. Never before, and certainly never after. Upstairs, the family would eat in comfort, unaware of the effort below. Luncheon was nearly ready, and the kitchen prepared itself for the next wave of work. The kitchen, already a flurry of motion as luncheon neared completion, became a stage for yet another ritual of labour. While the cook and one of the maids focused on the final touches of the midday meal, Mary was handed a different task, polishing the silver and brass. It was a job that appeared deceptively simple, but in reality it required both time and precision. The gleam of silver candlesticks on the dining table, the shine of brass doorknobs catching the light, these were not merely decorative touches. They were silent declarations of the household standard, a measure by which guests would judge the family's wealth and the servants' diligence. The items were brought to the kitchen in a careful procession, candlesticks, trays, serving dishes and teapots, each dulled by time and use. Even the smallest pieces, like teaspoons and drawer handles, were not exempt. A tarnished object was a betrayal of the household's image, and by extension, the servant's competence. Mary set to work, spreading a cloth on the table and laying out the tools of her trade, a tin of foul, smelling polish rags already stained black with residue, and a soft brush for the intricate details. Her hands moved methodically, dipping a rag into the paste and rubbing it onto the surface of a silver tray. The polish emitted a sharp chemical odour, stinging her nose and clinging to her skin. Without gloves to protect her hands, Mary had grown accustomed to the sting of irritation, the way her palms would become dry and stained after hours of work. She pressed harder, her strokes steady and deliberate, until the dull grey tarnish gave way to a bright mirrored shine. The transformation was satisfying in its own quiet way, but it was also exhausting. Each piece demanded the same care, the same pressure, the same attention to detail. Time felt strange during these moments. The repetitive nature of the work blurred its boundaries, and Mary's mind drifted as her hands remained occupied. She thought of nothing and everything all at once, of home, of her siblings, of the endless rhythm of her days. Polishing had a meditative quality, a way of loosening her thoughts even as the task demanded precision. But beneath the calm repetition lay a quiet tension. The silver was not hers, and if anything went missing, she knew the blame would find her. Servants were always guilty until proven innocent below stairs, and the loss of a single spoon could stain her reputation as surely as tarnish stained the metal she cleaned. Piece by piece, the pile of tarnished items diminished. The candlesticks glowed, their surfaces catching the flicker of the kitchen firelight. The brass teapot gleamed until it seemed almost golden, and the silver trays reflected the room like shallow pools of water. Mary wiped her hands on her apron, though the stains would not come off so easily. The polishing was done. The silver caught light like water catches sun. Upstairs, the family gathered for luncheon, and below stairs, everyone waited. Because when the family ate, servants stood ready to serve, to fetch, to respond to bells that might ring at any moment. The lunch hour was not an hour of rest. For the servants below stairs, it was a misnomer. A stretch of time defined less by activity and more by anticipation. Mary stood near the work table, her back straight, her hands clasped in front of her apron. The cook, seated in her wooden chair by the range, sipped from a steaming cup of tea, her expression unreadable. The kitchen, usually alive with motion and noise, had fallen into an uneasy stillness. But beneath the quiet there was tension, a taut string waiting to snap. The servants listened, not to each other, but to the walls. Somewhere above them, the family dined in comfort, and their needs were a constant, looming possibility. The servants' bell system hung in the hallway like a silent overseer. Each room upstairs had a bell pull, connected by wires to this central board. When a bell was tugged, the corresponding disc would swing, pointing to the room in need of attention. The system was ingenious in its simplicity, but for the servants, it was a source of perpetual anxiety. Mary's ears were attuned to the faintest sound. A jangle of the bells meant instant mobilization. Someone would rush to the board, read the room name, and ascend the staircase with urgency. The request might be for more bread, a different bottle of wine, a napkin dropped carelessly to the floor, or even a complaint about the soup being too hot or not hot enough. The demand didn't matter. What mattered was the speed and precision of the response. The cook, though seated, was not at ease. Any dissatisfaction with the meal would be reported directly to her, and though she held authority below stairs, she was not immune to the mistress's sharp words. The blame, however, often rolled downhill. A poorly seasoned dish or an overcooked piece of meat could result in a scolding, not for the cook, but for the kitchen maids who had no hand in the mistake. It was a culture of perfection, enforced through fear. Waiting in this state of readiness was its own kind of labor. Unlike the rhythm of peeling or scrubbing, it had no flow, no purpose beyond reaction. To stand still, to listen, to brace for the unknown. It was exhausting in a way that physical work never could be. Mary's muscles itched for movement, her mind restless with the tension of anticipation. Finally, the faint clatter of cutlery above signaled the end of the family's meal. The bells did not ring again, but the waiting was not over. The last plate came down from upstairs, and with it, the afternoon revealed itself. Hours of cleaning, hours of preparation for dinner, hours of standing, scrubbing, serving. The day was half over. Mary had worked for 8 hours. 10 more remained. The lunch trays returned to the kitchen, stacked high with plates, cups, and cutlery, each piece bearing the remnants of the family's meal. Mary stood ready at the long work table, her hands already reaching for the first plate. The familiar rhythm began again. Scrape, sort, wash, rinse, dry, repeat. The cycle was endless, but there was no time to dwell on its monotony. Lunch cleanup overlapped with the first stages of dinner preparation, and the kitchen was already stirring into a new kind of chaos. Mary worked quickly, scraping uneaten food into designated buckets. Bread crusts and meat scraps went into one, destined for the pig farmer. Vegetable peels and eggshells were set aside for composting. Plates were rinsed and handed off to the scullery maid, who scrubbed them in the deep stone sinks. The air in the kitchen grew heavier as the range roared to life again, its flames licking higher as more burners were engaged. The heat, already oppressive, seemed to radiate from every corner, wrapping the room in a suffocating warmth. The cook moved with purpose, her commands cutting through the clatter of dishes and the hiss of boiling pots. She had already begun preparing for dinner, a meal that would not be served for another 6 or 7 hours, but required meticulous planning and execution. Stocks simmered on the back of the range, their fragrant steam filling the kitchen. Sauces were started, their flavors carefully layered with herbs and spices. A maid darted down to the cellar, returning with baskets of carrots, onions, and turnips, their earthy smell adding to the symphony of aromas. Mary's role in this choreographed chaos was clear: to do what was asked of her, and to do it quickly. She peeled vegetables, her hands moving steadily as she worked through a growing pile of carrots. Her knife made soft, rhythmic scrapes against their orange skins, the sound almost lost in the background noise of the kitchen. Once peeled, the carrots were cut into even slices and set aside for the cook's inspection. Mary didn't have to ask if they were acceptable. The cook's curt nod was enough. The preparation for dinner was not merely about cooking, it was about timing. Some dishes required hours to cook, their flavors deepening with every passing minute. Others could not be started until the last possible moment to ensure freshness. The cook carried this intricate schedule in her mind, adjusting instinctively as she worked. There were no written recipes or timers to guide her, only experience, intuition, and the knowledge passed down from one cook to the next. She tasted as she went, a flick of the wrist here, a pinch of salt there, her movements as precise as a clockmaker's. The kitchen at 3 in the afternoon was already cooking dinner for 7, because time was an ingredient as important as salt, and if you misjudged it, everything failed. Mary watched the cook carefully, learning without being taught. She stirred pots when asked, fetched ingredients when needed, and absorbed the unspoken lessons in timing and balance that filled the room. Her feet ached, her back throbbed, and her hands were perpetually damp from washing. She hadn't sat down since the day began, but none of this mattered. The work wasn't measured by comfort or acknowledgement. You worked until the work was done. At precisely 4 o'clock, the kitchen's relentless pace softened for a brief moment. The servants' afternoon tea was not a luxury but a necessity, a small window of relief carved out of an otherwise unforgiving day. 15 to 20 minutes to drink warm tea and nibble on bread slathered with butter or jam. It was a pause, but one filled with urgency. To linger too long was to risk the ire of the cook or the mistress. Mary slipped into the small corner near the scullery, where a battered wooden table held a steaming pot of tea and a plate of thick bread slices. She barely tasted the food. The tea was strong and slightly bitter, but it warmed her cold fingers and soothed the rawness of her throat. Standing or perched on a stool, the maids gathered in small groups, sharing quick words before the next round of labour began. The tea break was a rare chance to breathe, to exchange news, to listen and speak, if only in hushed tones. Gossip was the currency below stairs. In those few minutes, Mary drank in more than tea. Who was courting whom upstairs, which family was slipping into financial trouble, which cook had been dismissed for drinking too much. All these stories flowed freely, passed between servants like precious secrets. Privacy was a fragile concept in Victorian households. The wealthy lived surrounded by servants who were always present, always listening, yet never supposed to speak unless commanded. The paradox created a vast informal network of information. Servants knew everything about the families they served, about other servants in neighbouring houses, and even about local tradesmen and their scandals. Some servants took this knowledge a step further, selling gossip to newspapers or rival households. It was a dangerous gamble, risking dismissal and blacklisting, but the extra income was sometimes worth it. For many, information was one of the few assets they owned in a world that denied them possessions or status. The tea break was also a moment of physical reprieve. Mary sank onto a stool, the first time that day she allowed herself to rest her aching feet. The swelling in her ankles was constant, the result of hours spent standing on cold stone floors. Her muscles, tight from endless movement, relaxed briefly in the warmth of the kitchen. She took a deep breath, the exhaustion that had been masked by constant activity pressing in now like a weight. Yet even in this brief respite, the demands of service never fully loosened their grip. The break was short, the time to rest minimal. The clock was ticking, and soon the kitchen would roar back to life. Still, those 15 minutes of tea were precious. Moments where Mary could be more than a kitchen maid. She could be a woman, a thinker, a bearer of stories. In 15 minutes of afternoon tea, she drank information as much as tea. Who was courting whom upstairs, which family was in financial trouble, which cook had been dismissed for drinking. Because information was currency in a world where you owned almost nothing. The tea was drunk, the gossip exchanged, and now came the task that separated the strong from the weak. The floors had to be scrubbed. The kitchen floor was unforgiving, stone cold, hard, and unyielding beneath Mary's day without fail. It demanded an hour of relentless scrubbing, a task as exhausting as it was necessary. Buckets of steaming water were hauled from the range, heavy with heat, each one mixed with lye soap whose sting burned her skin on contact. There were no shortcuts, no machines to ease the burden, just a bristle brush, raw determination, and the unforgiving floor. Mary knelt down, her body folding forward over the rough stone. She pressed hard, scrubbing in long, methodical strokes, moving backward carefully, so she would T-step on the sections she had already cleaned. The cold bit through the thin cloth wrapped around her knees, bruising flesh that had long since grown accustomed to pain. Some maids tried padding or cloth wraps for relief, but in strict households, such softness was considered weakness. Endurance was expected, and Mary had learned to endure. The floor beneath her was a patchwork of grease, food scraps, coal ash, and dirt trampled in from outside. Without this daily ritual, the surface would become slick and dangerous, a hazard in a kitchen where every step counted. The scrubbing was not just about cleanliness. It was about safety, about maintaining the invisible order that kept the household running smoothly. Time lost its usual meaning as Mary counted the floor in sections, rather than minutes. Each square of stone was a milestone, a small victory in a long, grueling battle. The pain in her knees and back stretched her perception. Minutes felt like hours, yet the work had to continue. Her hands, raw and irritated from the lye, gripped the brush with steady resolve. There was no room for distraction. The task demanded complete focus. Despite the brutal physical toll, there was a strange rhythm to the work. The repetitive motion, the steady sound of bristles against stone, became almost meditative. Her mind wandered briefly, seeking refuge in memories or quiet thoughts, but the floor's relentless demand kept pulling her back. The kitchen was a world of labor without end, where every day's effort was erased by the next, and the cycle repeated endlessly. She scrubbed the floor on her knees for an hour, and the floor, indifferent to her effort, would be just as dirty tomorrow, requiring the same hour, the same pain, the same silence. It was a truth Mary accepted without complaint, a rhythm she had folded into the fabric of her existence. At last, she rose slowly, her joints stiff from the prolonged strain. The stone floor gleamed wet and clean beneath her, the dark stains and grime washed away. She threw out the dirty water, the final act in this grueling ritual, and glanced at the clock. It was 5:30 p.m. Dinner preparations were entering their critical phase, and the kitchen's pace was about to shift again. Every household had two economies, the visible one of wages and expenses, and the invisible one of traded favors, stolen moments, and negotiated silences that made the whole system actually function. Beneath the rigid hierarchy of Victorian service, where every job had its place and every servant knew their rank, there existed an informal network that operated quietly, out of sight of the family. It was a system created by necessity, born from the limitations of meager wages and the constant pressure to survive. Servants learned quickly how to make use of what little was available to them. A lady's maid, for instance, might offer a cast-off dress from her mistress to a housemaid in exchange for assistance. with mending or covering a shift. In the kitchen, scraps of extra food might be shared among the staff in return for a favour or, more commonly, for silence. A scullery maid who turned a blind eye to a kitchen maid sneaking a leftover piece of bacon could expect the gesture to be repaid later, perhaps with help during a particularly grueling task. These exchanges were unspoken but understood, forming a quiet economy of trust and barter. Then there were the perquisites, or perks, items that technically belonged to the household, but were unofficially allowed to supplement the servant's income. Used tea leaves, for example, could be dried and resoled to poorer families for reuse. Drippings from roasted meat scraped into jars were valuable for cooking and could fetch a modest price. Leftover candle stubs were melted down and repurposed, and empty bottles were returned for their deposit value. These small allowances, while hardly life-changing, could add £2-3 to a servant's annual income of around £10, a significant increase in a world where every penny mattered. But this hidden economy wasn't always benign. Beneath the surface of mutual favours and small perks lay a darker side. Cooks who wielded considerable power below stairs sometimes demanded kickbacks from younger servants. A kitchen maid might hand over part of her earnings or offer gifts to ensure the cook's tolerance for minor mistakes, or worse, to secure a slightly better position. The power dynamics within this system mirrored the larger hierarchy, creating opportunities for exploitation even among those who shared the same struggles. These economies were neither fair nor just, but they were a reality of life below stairs. They gave servants a semblance of agency in a world that otherwise offered little control. Through these quiet negotiations, they found ways to make their lives just a fraction more bearable. Yet all the negotiation and trading in the world didn't change the fact that dinner was in 2 hours, and dinner waited for no one. The hidden economies faded into the background as Mary turned back to the endless demands of the kitchen. The afternoon light slanted through the narrow kitchen windows, illuminating the long work table where Mary stood. Before her lay a mountain of raw vegetables, their earthy smell mixing with the faint heat from the range. Dinner was the centerpiece of the Victorian day, and even for a family-only meal, it was a grand affair. 7 to 10 courses, each one requiring meticulous preparation. The vegetables alone were a task that consumed hours, a quiet but essential part of the performance. Mary began with the potatoes, their rough skins cool beneath her fingers. One by one she peeled them, the blade of her knife gliding in steady strokes. Unlike in poorer households, where every sliver of potato skin was saved to stretch the meal further, here speed was more important than economy. The peelings were thick, curling into soft spirals that dropped into the waste bucket at her feet. The potatoes, smooth and pale now, were placed in a bowl of cold water to prevent them from browning. Next came the carrots, their vibrant orange skins flashing as Mary worked. The knife moved in a rhythm so familiar it felt automatic: peel, trim, cut. The tops were discarded, the roots sliced into even pieces. Then the turnips, their waxy skins tougher to remove, required a firmer grip and sharper cuts. Onions followed, their pungent aroma stinging Mary's eyes as she halved and chopped them. Celery stalks were trimmed of their rough ends, their crisped texture snapping beneath her blade. Green beans were topped and tailed, peas shelled one by one, tiny spheres tumbling into a waiting bowl. The sheer quantity was staggering. For a dinner serving 8 people, the kitchen needed 10 pounds of trimmed vegetables, 15 or 20 pounds in their raw state. The waste pile grew steadily at Mary's feet, a heap of peelings, stems and roots. The vegetables themselves, pristine and uniform, were arranged neatly in bowls. They would not be cooked for hours yet, but everything had to be ready, waiting for the precise moment the cook called for them. As Mary worked, time seemed to stretch and blur. The repetitive nature of the task created a kind of trance, her thoughts drifting even as her hands remained steady. She thought of nothing and everything, of the clock ticking on the wall, of the dinner bell that would ring hours from now, of the endless cycle of labor that defined her days. The rhythm of peeling and chopping became its own form of meditation, the motions soothing in their predictability. She peeled and chopped and trimmed until her hands moved without thought. And in that mindless rhythm, she found the day's only meditation, the only time her hands were busy enough that her mind could finally rest. At last, the work was done. The potatoes, carrots, and turnips sat in water-filled bowls, ready to be boiled or roasted. The onions were chopped, the beans trimmed, the peas shelled, the vegetables were ready, arranged beautifully, but vegetables were only one element. A Victorian dinner was a performance, and every element had to be perfect, including the table itself. The kitchen and the dining room were worlds apart, separated not just by floors and walls, but by purpose. The dining room was a place of elegance, conversation, and display, a stage where the family and their guests performed the rituals of Victorian dining. The kitchen, in contrast, was the engine room below, unseen and unacknowledged, where the labour that made the performance possible took place. A kitchen maid like Mary would never step into the dining room during service. That was the domain of the footman, the parlour maids, and the butler, those who were trained to move seamlessly between the two worlds, bridging the gap without disrupting the illusion. Yet, despite being physically separate, the kitchen and dining room were intimately connected. Their relationship relied on precision, communication, and timing. Orders came down to the kitchen through a variety of methods. In grander households, speaking tubes, small, brass pipes, allowed servants upstairs to speak directly to the kitchen staff, their voices distant and hollow as they travelled through the walls. In other homes, the butler or a footman would descend the stairs to inspect the dishes personally before they were sent up. And then there were the bells. A system of wires and pulleys connected each room upstairs to a central board in the servants' hallway. A single tug on the bell pull would send a corresponding disc swinging on the board, indicating which room required attention. The sound of a bell was both a command and a warning. The household's needs would not wait. Timing was everything. The courses of a Victorian dinner followed a carefully choreographed sequence, each arriving at the dining table at just the right moment. The cook relied on intuition and experience to manage this delicate balance. She knew how long it would take for the soup to simmer to perfection, for the roast to rest, for the souffle to rise. There were no clocks in the dining room to guide her, only signals from the footman or butler who would descend to the kitchen with subtle cues. It's time for the fish course, the roast, the dessert too fast, and guests would feel rushed, their conversations interrupted. Too slow, and the food would cool, or worse, boredom would creep in. A single delay could ruin the evening, no matter how exquisite the food. The visual presentation of the dishes was equally important. Victorian dining was a spectacle of abundance and artistry. Dishes were arranged with an eye for symmetry and grandeur. Elaborately moulded jellies shimmered like jewels, their vibrant colours catching the candlelight. Sugar sculptures, delicate and intricate, adorned the centre of the table, meant to be admired more than eaten. Platters of fruit and flowers were arranged as though painted by a still-life artist. These creations were not just food, they were statements of wealth, skill and taste. The kitchen produced art, not merely sustenance. The food would travel from the kitchen to the dining room, a journey of perhaps 40 feet and 3 flights of stairs, and in that journey, hot food had to stay hot, cold food had to stay cold, and perfection had to remain perfect. The pressure was immense, but the system relied on a steady rhythm of experience to keep it moving. Mary, however, would never see the dining room during service, never watch the family eat what she had helped to prepare. Her role was to keep the kitchen functioning while others performed upstairs, ensuring that every dish that left her hands was worthy of the spectacle above. At precisely 6:30, the kitchen shifted into a frenzy of motion and heat. The calm, steady rhythm of the day gave way to something far more urgent, a controlled chaos that demanded every ounce of skill and attention from Mary, the cook, and the rest of the staff. The range roared beneath multiple pots, each bubbling and steaming with sauces, stocks and roasts, filling the air with rich, savoury aromas. The scent of roasting meat mingled with the scent of baking pastries, creating a heady perfume that seemed to pulse with the heartbeat of the kitchen itself. The cook's voice sliced through the noise, Short, sharp commands that set the tempo. Sauce on the left, garnish the duck. Watch the gravy. Every instruction was met with immediate response as hands stirred, lifted, carried, and arranged. Mary moved between tasks with practiced ease, stirring a pot of thickened sauce, fetching herbs from the larder, washing dishes as soon as they were used to ensure nothing slowed the flow. The clatter of plates and cutlery being cleaned echoed beneath the constant hum of boiling liquids and sizzling fat. Footmen descended the stairs in measured steps, their polished shoes tapping softly on stone. They arrived to collect each course, balancing trays laden with steaming food that had to be served at just the right moment. The kitchen's choreography was flawless, every movement timed to the second. The cook directed the senior kitchen maids, who handled vegetables and garnishing with skill. Mary and the junior maids took on the essential but less glamorous tasks, stirring, carrying, washing, each vital to maintaining the delicate balance. The heat was relentless. Steam rose in thick clouds, clinging to faces and dampening sleeves. The range's fire was both friend and foe, providing the necessary warmth but demanding constant attention. The kitchen was alive, a single organism made up of many parts, each dependent on the others to keep the whole functioning. For 90 minutes, every hand moved with purpose, every eye watched for the cook's signal, every mind held a dozen tasks in perfect balance. This was the most skilled work of the day. There was no room for error, no tolerance for delay. The timing was everything. If a sauce was late or a garnish forgotten, the entire meal could be compromised. Yet, beneath the pressure, there was a quiet pride, a knowledge that this dance of fire, food, and timing was a tradition passed down through generations. As each course was carried upstairs, the kitchen held its breath. The first plate left, then the next, each movement precise and deliberate. And then, with the last course delivered and the dining room door closed behind the footman, the kitchen exhaled. But only for a moment, because now came the clean-up that would last until midnight. The family lingered over dessert and port, the clink of glasses and soft murmur of voices floating down the stairwell. Upstairs, they savoured the last moments of the evening, unaware of the storm of work raging below. The kitchen, however, was far from quiet. A mountain of dishes, pots, and pans awaited, each piece bearing the residue of a day's worth of labour. For Mary and the other kitchen staff, the largest clean-up of the day was just beginning. Mary's hands moved mechanically as she scraped plates, some still holding remnants of food she had helped prepare hours before. The smell of roast meat and sweet pudding mixed with the sting of soap and scalding water. Pots caked with baked-on gravy were scrubbed relentlessly, roasting pans polished until they shone under the flickering kitchen light. The range, blackened and worn, demanded attention, ashes cleared, surfaces scrubbed and polished, ready for the next day's fire. Floors were swept and mopped, the cold stone gleaming wet and spotless. Dishes were stacked and put away with precision, every spoon, every cup accounted for. Exhaustion pressed on Mary's body. Her feet throbbed with pain from hours standing on unforgiving stone. Her back ached in places she couldn't name, stiff and unrelenting. Her hands were raw from constant exposure to water and harsh soaps. Yet, despite the fatigue, the work could not be rushed or left incomplete. The cook's inspection was unforgiving. Any hint of dirt or a misplaced item meant longer hours or sharp words. The staff moved with silent understanding. No one left until the kitchen was spotless and ready for the next day. Time in this state became distorted. Minutes stretched endlessly, each movement automatic and unthinking. The mind focused only on the immediate task: scrape, wash, rinse, dry, because looking beyond the next dish was overwhelming. Yet within this shared exhaustion, a quiet camaraderie sometimes blossomed. Tired hands would briefly help a neighbour with a heavy pot. A whispered word of encouragement passed between maids, a small kindness amid relentless labour. At 10 o'clock, with every muscle screaming for rest, Mary washed dishes she had already washed twice that day. Her thoughts were narrow, fixed on the one word she longed to hear from the cook: done. That word would signal release, the end of the day's endless cycle, and the promise of sleep brief and hard. The last dish was scrubbed clean, the final surface wiped. pots hung in their places, the kitchen restored to order. Finally, after 16 hours, the cook nodded. "We're done." Mary rose slowly and began the climb up the dark, narrow stairs, toward the attic room, toward the fragile refuge of sleep that would come instantly and end all too soon. The clock struck 7, and the kitchen transformed. It was no longer a space of mere labor. It became a battlefield of precision, a stage where every move had to be flawless. This was the final hour before dinner, the moment when all the planning, preparation, and hours of effort either came together in harmony or unraveled completely. The tension was palpable, the stakes impossibly high. The cook, who had spent the day overseeing the rhythm of the kitchen, now became something else entirely. She was no longer a teacher, guiding her staff with measured commands. In this hour, she transformed into a general, marshalling her troops with sharp words and swift gestures. Perfection had a deadline, and that deadline was inflexible as death. Mary stood at her station, her hands moving quickly but carefully as she prepared garnishes for the plated dishes. Chopped parsley, sprigs of thyme, and delicate curls of lemon peel were arranged in neat rows, ready to adorn the plates. The cook's voice rang out, cutting through the haze of steam and noise. "How's the sauce? Glossy, no lumps." "Let me see." At the stove, another maid whisked furiously, her brow furrowed with concentration. The sauce, which had nearly broken minutes earlier, now shimmered with the perfect sheen of success. A nod from the cook sent her back to her task with a sigh of relief. Meanwhile, the main dishes were inspected and arranged with the care of an artist composing a masterpiece. A roast of beef, its exterior bronzed to perfection, was sliced to reveal a center of warm red pork, as per tradition, was cooked through and golden, the juices sealed within. Vegetables, cut to uniform size and color, were arranged in symmetrical patterns, their vibrant hues providing contrast to the meat. Pastries, golden and puffed high, sat cooling on the sideboard, their buttery aroma mingling with the sharper tang of sauces and the earthy scent of roasted meat. The cook moved from dish to dish, her sharp eyes catching even the smallest imperfection. A garnish had wilted under the heat of the kitchen lamps. It was replaced in seconds with a fresh sprig. A souffle that had risen just shy of perfect was plated strategically, its flaw hidden under a flourish of grated cheese and herbs. Nothing escaped her notice, and nothing was left to chance. Mary watched closely, her hands still busy with her assigned tasks, but her mind absorbing everything. The cook's mastery of timing, her ability to adjust and adapt without hesitation, was something Mary admired deeply and hoped one day to emulate. Though her role was small, she felt the weight of this hour. Each plate, each garnish, each perfectly arranged dish was a reflection of the entire kitchen. If anything failed, the blame would ripple downward, and Mary knew how unforgiving that chain of accountability could be. The plating itself was an art form. Dishes were not thrown together but composed with care. Symmetry was key, as was color contrast and height. A dish that looked flat or uneven was unacceptable, no matter how good it tasted. Cold dishes had to be chilled to perfection, their temperatures carefully maintained until the moment they left the kitchen. Hot dishes had to be served steaming, their aromas enticing the diners before the first bite. Each plate was a promise, a visual and sensory declaration of the household's standards. As the final seconds ticked away, the kitchen held its breath. A soup tureen, sterling silver polished to mirror brightness, was the first to leave. The footman descended the stairs, lifting the tray with practiced ease. The tureen, filled with hours of work, condensed into a single bowl of velvety liquid, made its way to the dining room. The first course was up, and the performance had begun. The dinner service began with the first course, a tureen of soup carried upstairs by a footman with measured steps. The kitchen, though briefly quieter, did not slow. The pace quickened instead, a relentless rhythm dictated by the flow of courses. Victorian dinners were grand affairs, each course a spectacle in its own right, and tonight's menu was no exception. Soup, fish, entree, roast, game, savoury, dessert, and finally fruit and cheese. The procession of dishes seemed endless. Each one demanded precision, timing, and the unrelenting energy of the kitchen staff. The soup was the opener, a clear consomme shimmering golden in the polished tureen, or sometimes a thick cream-based bisque, velvety and rich. The cook had tasted it moments before, adjusting the seasoning with a final flick of salt. Mary had stood nearby, wiping bowls to a flawless shine, ensuring no smudge or water spot ruined the presentation. As the first course left the kitchen, the next was already underway. 15 minutes, a small window between courses, became an eternity of motion below stairs. The emptied soup bowls were returned promptly, clinking softly on the trays as they were carried down. Mary took her place by the sink, washing and drying with swift efficiency, knowing some items might be needed again for later courses. The footman's return signalled the call for the next act, fish. The fish course was a moment of artistry. Whole fish perfectly poached and laid out with precision. Its silvery skin glistening, was accompanied by delicate sauces poured into matching serving dishes. Sometimes the fish was served as fillets, each portion arranged with garnishes of lemon slices and parsley, their vibrant colours a contrast to the pale flesh. Timing was critical here. The fish had to be warm but not overcooked, its texture yielding but firm. The cook supervised the plating like a conductor overseeing an orchestra, her sharp eyes missing nothing. Mary fetched garnishes from the larder in quick bursts, her hands trembling slightly as she passed them to the senior maids for final placement. The entree followed, a more complex dish, a vol, au vent perhaps, its golden pastry shell filled with creamy chicken and mushrooms, or a fricassee rich with sauce and layered flavours. The cook's skill was most evident here, each element of the dish a testament to her experience and intuition. Mary watched as the plates were assembled, her own hands busy stirring a pot of gravy that would accompany the roast to come. The roast course was the centerpiece of the meal. Tonight it was beef, its exterior dark and caramelized, its interior a deep, glistening red. The cook carved the meat dramatically, each slice falling perfectly onto the waiting platter. Around it, the vegetables, potatoes roasted to golden perfection, carrots cut into precise shapes, and greens steamed just enough to retain their color, all arranged like a painter's composition. The platter was carried upstairs with reverence, its arrival signaling the height of the evening's meal. Game followed, the indulgence of an upper-class table. Partridge, venison, or pheasant, roasted and paired with rich sauces, reminded guests of the wealth required to secure such delicacies. Afterward came the savoury, a small cheese-based dish such as Welsh rabbit or a souffle, meant to cleanse the palate and prepare for the sweetness to follow. Dessert was nothing short of theatre. Puddings steamed to perfection, trifles layered with custard and fruit, or elaborate confections like sugar sculptures and moulded jellies that shimmered like stained glass. These were not merely food but displays of wealth and artistry, designed to dazzle as much as to satisfy. Mary stood to the side, exhausted but captivated, watching the cook arrange the final touches. A drizzle of custard here, a scattering of sugared almonds there. The final course, fruit and cheese, was prepared with less fanfare but no less care. Platters of fresh fruit were polished to a high shine, their vibrant colours almost glowing. Cheeses wrapped in muslin were cut into neat wedges and paired with biscuits. These were the meal's closing notes, a quiet yet elegant conclusion to the symphony of flavours. Each course that went upstairs represented an hour of preparation below, and the family ate it in 10 minutes, never knowing the hands that had prepared it, never thinking about the labour transformed into leisure. For the staff below stairs there was no applause, no acknowledgement, only the sound of returning dishes and the rush to prepare for the next stage. As the final course ascended, the kitchen fell into strange stillness, not rest but waiting. Upstairs the family lingered over port and conversation. Below, the staff stood ready, watching the clock, knowing that every minute the family spent in comfort was a minute added to their own working day. The dining room above hummed faintly with the sounds of clinking glasses and low voices, the family lingering over wine and conversation. Below stairs, the kitchen staff stood in silence, caught in the peculiar limbo of waiting. The main rush of dinner service was over, each course sent up and received with precision, but the work was far from done. The dishes had yet to come down, and until they did, the servants were tethered to the kitchen, unable to begin the monumental task of cleaning. Mary leaned against the cool stone wall, her arms crossed loosely over her apron. Her feet ached from the endless hours of standing, her back stiff from the strain of constant motion. She wanted to sit, but the thought of rising again made her legs feel heavier than they already were. Some servants perched on stools, their postures slumped, their faces blank with exhaustion. A few exchanged hushed words, sharing scraps of gossip or quietly venting frustration. The cook sat in her chair near the range, her posture rigid despite the toll of the evening. The room was quiet, save for the occasional clatter of a pan being repositioned or a soft sigh escaping tired lips. This was the most maddening part of the night, the waiting. Servants couldn't rest fully because the bells might ring at any moment, summoning them upstairs for more wine, additional bread, or another indulgent request. Nor could they leave their posts or begin the heavy work of cleaning. The family's leisure was the servants' unpaid overtime, and if the conversation upstairs stretched late into the night, so too would the hours below stairs. There was no compensation for this, no acknowledgement. It was simply the way things were. In the stillness, Mary's thoughts wandered, though she tried to keep them at bay. In the waiting, she had time to think, and thinking was dangerous, because thinking led to questions about why her labour enriched others while leaving her perpetually on the edge of poverty. Her wages, meagre as they were, barely covered the cost of her own survival, let alone the futures she sometimes imagined. She thought of the shop she might open one day, a small bakery perhaps, where her skills could serve her rather than someone else. But the thought was fleeting. The reality was always heavier. Her earnings were too small, her expenses too great, and the escape from service was a dream most maids never realized. The emotions of waiting were layered and complex: resentment at the long hours and lack of gratitude, acceptance of the life she had no choice but to endure, and a quiet, stubborn pride in work done well. The frustration simmered beneath the surface, but it was tempered by years of obedience. After all, what else could she do but wait? And then the sound they had all been anticipating, the bell. Its sharp jangle broke the stillness, and the servants stirred to life. The first tray descended, followed by another. The family was finished. The servant's work was not. She knew everything about the family upstairs, their debts, their secrets, their fears, and they knew nothing about her, not even her surname. In that asymmetry lay the true nature of service. The family lived their lives in front of an audience they barely acknowledged. Every word spoken, every glance exchanged, every crack in their carefully constructed image, witnessed by the people who set their table and cleaned their rooms. Privacy was an illusion, because privacy could not exist in a house filled with servants. Mary, like the others below stairs, had learned to listen without appearing to listen, to see without being seen. Servants moved silently through corridors, carried trays into rooms mid-conversation, and passed by doors left ajar. They heard arguments over money, whispers of marital infidelity, confessions of ill health, and the unguarded moments of vulnerability that came when the family believed themselves alone. They knew which marriages were strained, which children had been born with questionable parentage, and which guests brought scandal in their wake. The knowledge was endless, a constant stream of truths overheard and unspoken. This knowledge was power, but it was power that could rarely be used. To gossip openly about one's employer was to invite ruin. A servant caught spreading rumours faced not just dismissal but blacklisting. Their name passed quietly among households until no one would hire them. Discretion was the unspoken price of survival, and for most it was a price worth paying. Still, information flowed in quieter ways. Servants shared stories with one another in whispered conversations during tea breaks or over laundry basins. The network was vast and invisible, connecting kitchens and sculleries across the city. A valet in one house might know of a mistress's affair in another. A housemaid might hear of a bankruptcy before the family's creditors did. Some families earned their servants' respect. They were kind, generous, and appreciative, treating those below stairs with dignity. For these families, the servants worked with care, going the extra mile to ensure things ran smoothly. But other families were cruel, dismissive, and exploitative, seeing their staff as little more than tools. For them, the work was done grudgingly, just enough to meet expectations, but never more. The servants knew which families deserved their effort and which didn't. Mary knew the cookham's secrets as surely as she knew the weight of the coal bucket in her hands. She knew the mistress's quiet anxiety about money, the master's frequent trips that didn't quite line up with his business meetings, and the whispered arguments behind closed doors. She knew, but she said nothing. To know everything and yet remain invisible, to be trusted because you were never truly seen, was the paradox of service. But knowledge didn't clean dishes and secrets didn't scrub pots. So she returned to the work that defined her existence, transforming chaos back into order, so tomorrow could begin exactly the same way. The final cleanup was a marathon of endurance, a grueling ritual that stretched long into the night. As the family's laughter and conversation faded behind closed doors, Mary returned to the endless task awaiting her in the kitchen. Every dish, pot, pan, utensil, and serving piece used during dinner now demanded her attention. The work was systematic and unforgiving, a parade of delicate china and crystal glassware first, each item washed with care and dried immediately to prevent the faintest water spot from marring its surface. Mary's hands moved methodically, rinsing each cup and saucer, her fingers slick with soap and water. The china was fragile, and any breakage meant a deduction from her wages. The glassware, the wine glasses and tumblers, required constant vigilance. A single fingerprint or smudge was enough to draw scorn. Once the china was done, she turned to the silver serving pieces. Polished earlier, they needed washing and drying again, their surfaces demanding the same careful attention lest tarnish return overnight. Then came the cooking pots and pans, some blackened from hours of roasting and boiling, their surfaces crusted with burnt food. These required scrubbing with fierce effort, the bristles scraping against metal and stone. Mary's arms ached with the exertion, the repetitive motion making her muscles scream. The roasting pans and baking sheets, heavy, unwieldy, were last. Their weight was a burden, especially after 15 hours on her feet. Lifting them into the soapy water and hauling them out again tested every ounce of her strength. Her hands bore the mark of the day's labor, wrinkled from constant water exposure, cracked at the knuckles, fingers stained and bleeding from countless tiny cuts. Her feet, swollen from hours standing on cold stone, felt cramped and tight inside her worn boots. Her back throbbed with pain, the bending over sinks and agony she had learned to endure without complaint. Yet, despite this exhaustion, the work could not be rushed. The morning inspection would reveal any inadequately cleaned items, and those would be met with punishment. There was no allowance for tiredness. The kitchen demanded perfection at every hour. The last pot she washed that night weighed 15 pounds empty and represented the 1,000th time she'd placed her hands in water that day, and tomorrow the count would begin again at 0. The cycle was unending, relentless and exacting. But Mary pressed on, her movements automatic now, her mind focused only on the task at hand. The kitchen was silent except for the splash of water and the scrape of brush against metal. She knew that when this work was done, she would climb those dark stairs to the attic room and collapse into sleep that would last only hours before it was time to begin again. The last dish was washed, dried, and put away. The last dish was put away, and the kitchen began its final transformation. The day's relentless pace slowed to a quiet, methodical rhythm as Mary and the other servants prepared the space for tomorrow's battle. The process was part practicality, part ritual, a careful tending meant to cradle the kitchen through the night and coax better results from the fire come morning. The cook knelt by the range, adjusting the coals with practiced hands. She banked the fire, piling embers and controlling air vents so the heat would smolder gently without burning out. This delicate balance was more than science. It was superstition, a belief passed down that a properly put to bed kitchen promised a smoother day ahead. The fire was the heart of the house, and it had to be cared for as tenderly as any living thing. Mary moved to refill the water jugs, heavy and cold in her hands. Each was topped up from the well, the fresh water cool and clear. Coal scuttles were replenished, their black contents shining under the dim light, ready to fuel the morning blaze. Floors were swept and mopped one last time, the stone gleaming faintly in the low glow of the kitchen lamps. Food in the larder was covered carefully, wrapped to keep it fresh, and windows and doors were checked and secured against the night's chill. The house above was silent now, the family asleep in their warm beds, unaware of the last movements below. The servants moved through the dim corridors almost without sound, too tired to speak, too worn to argue, their tasks completed through muscle memory and shared understanding. There was a strange intimacy in this quiet labor. No hierarchy, no pretense, just people who had survived the day together. In these final minutes, small acts of kindness appeared. One maid would finish another's resting task, allowing her a few extra moments of rest. A whispered thank you passed between hands still damp from washing. Brief moments of humanity amidst the harshness of service. In those final minutes, when exhaustion had stripped away pretense and hierarchy, they were simply people who shared the same exhausting existence. And sometimes, briefly, that shared exhaustion became shared humanity. The cook surveyed the kitchen one final time, nodded once, and spoke the words that ended every day, "Get to bed." And up those dark stairs they went, toward the attic rooms and the sleep that would last 4 hours before beginning again. Mary's slow climb up the narrow servants' staircase felt like moving through a fading dream. The heat and noise of the kitchen receded behind her, replaced by the cold silence of the upper floors. She moved from light to darkness, from warmth to chill, trading the communal bustle for the solitude of the attic. Each step required conscious effort. Her legs were heavy and uncooperative, her mind thick with exhaustion and fog. This ascent mirrored her morning descent, but in reverse, a journey away from life and into rest, though rest was a fragile promise. Sleep beckoned like falling, like disappearing, like a final merciful release. It was not gentle or slow. It came suddenly, shutting the door on consciousness with the finality of a slammed shutter. Her attic room was small and bare, stark against the warmth she left behind. The walls offered no comfort, the air unheated even in winter's chill. The furniture was minimal, a narrow straw, stuffed bed, a small wooden chest for the few possessions she owned, and perhaps a single chair. No decoration softened the Spartan austerity, only the bare essentials needed for survival. Mary's nightly ritual was brief and practical. She slipped off her work dress with care, hanging it neatly. She owned only 2, and both had to last. With water from a cold pitcher, she washed her face and hands, the sharp coldness a fleeting shock to her weary body. She unpinned her hair, letting it fall freely in soft waves, one small act of comfort in a harsh world. There were no nightgowns, no warm linens. Changing clothes required energy she no longer had. She settled beneath a coarse blanket in her undergarments, the rough fabric familiar. The straw mattress creaked softly beneath her weight as she collapsed, surrendering to the long-awaited oblivion. Sleep came not gently but absolutely, like a door slamming shut on consciousness. 4 hours of oblivion before the church bells would ring again, and she would wake to discover that nothing had changed except the date. She slept, and 4 hours later she woke, and the day began again, identical, relentless, eternal, but not every day was the same. The week had rhythms, and those rhythms shaped servant life in ways the daily routine didn't reveal. The daily wage was counted in shillings, but the real cost of service was counted in years. Years separated from family, years without education, years watching life from below stairs while others lived it above. For Mary and countless others like her, service demanded more than physical labor. It consumed every corner of their lives, leaving little room for anything beyond the endless cycle of work. The social costs began early. Most kitchen maids entered service between the ages of 12 and 14, sent away from home to reduce the number of mouths to feed. For many, this separation from family was near total. The lucky ones saw their parents and siblings once a year at Christmas. The unlucky ones might go years without returning home. Friendships were fleeting, confined to the household and shaped by the rigid hierarchy of rank. Romantic relationships were often forbidden. Employers frowned on servants having followers, suitors who might distract them from their duties. For women, marriage was a distant, often unattainable prospect. Few had the opportunity to meet potential husbands, and fewer still had a dowry to bring to a marriage. Many remained in service until physical deterioration forced them out. often around age 40, with no family of their own to care for them. The costs were not only social but physical. The damp, cold conditions of the kitchen left lasting scars, arthritis from kneeling on stone floors, respiratory problems from coal smoke and poor ventilation, vision issues from working in dim light. Overwork and poor nutrition took their toll, especially on women. Reproductive issues were common, and many suffered miscarriages or infertility. The long-term health impacts of service were rarely acknowledged, let alone addressed. A servant was expected to endure, and when she could no longer endure, she was replaced. Psychologically, service stunted personal development. There was no time for reading, self-improvement, or education. A servant's existence was defined entirely by the needs of others. Her identity subsumed by her role, the kitchen maid, the housemaid, the scullery maid. Her life was not her own, and her aspirations, if they existed, were postponed indefinitely. This was the price of service, a life spent in the shadow of others, a lifetime of labour that enriched employers while leaving servants with nothing but worn bodies and fading years. But within this daily sameness, patterns emerged, weekly rhythms and seasonal shifts that created variety within routine, and sometimes, briefly, created opportunity. Monday was washing day, a universal truth across Victorian households. After the chaos of weekend guests, formal dinners and extra demands, Monday brought its own distinct labour, laundry. It was an enormous undertaking, a task that began at dawn and stretched long into the evening, leaving no corner of the house untouched by the damp, steamy atmosphere. Every household linen, tablecloth, bedsheet, napkin, and item of personal clothing was washed, scrubbed, boiled, rinsed, and dried, all by hand. The process began with water, hundreds of gallons hauled and heated over roaring fires. Massive copper vessels were filled and brought to a boil, their steam curling into the already heavy air. Lye soap and washing soda, harsh and caustic, were added to the tubs to break down grease and stains. The laundry maids, responsible for the bulk of the washing, plunged their hands into the scalding water, scrubbing each item on wooden washboards or kneading them in tubs. Whites were boiled to achieve their brightness, while coloured fabrics were washed separately, taking care not to bleed dyes. Rinsing came next, requiring multiple changes of water until the soap was finally cleared away. Then came the wringing. Wet linens, heavy with water, were twisted by hand or fed through mechanical wringers, their weight sometimes exceeding 40 pounds. The kitchen staff, though not primarily responsible for laundry, wasn't exempt. Mary and the others washed their own work clothes, aprons, dresses, and cloths, dirtied by the grease and grime of the kitchen. If the household was short on laundry maids or the workload particularly heavy, they were called in to assist. The physical toll was immense. Hands burned and reddened from the chemicals and hot water, backs strained from lifting and wringing soaked linens, and the never-ending dampness seeped into their skin. By midday, the air in the laundry room was thick with steam, the smell of soap and sweat mingling in equal measure. Why Monday? The answer was simple. Weekends were too chaotic. Guests came and went, dinners stretched late into the night, and linens were used in abundance. Monday became the day to reset the household, to restore order. It was also, strangely, a social day. Laundry required many hands, and for lower servants, this was often the only time they worked alongside others from different parts of the house. Conversations flowed as linens were scrubbed and wrung, quiet laughter occasionally breaking through the shared exhaustion. By evening, the house was filled with damp fabrics hung to dry on lines stretched across courtyards or attic spaces. Every servant's hands were raw, every back was aching, and every stitch of fabric in the house was somehow cleaner than when the day began. Tuesday came as relief, not because the work was easier, but because it was different, and difference was the closest thing to rest that servant life offered. The week turned like a wheel, each day a spoke marked by its specific labour, and on that wheel, servants rode toward nowhere, moving constantly but never arriving, working perpetually but never finishing. Each day brought its own character, its own demands, its own small reprieves, though the routines of cooking and cleaning threaded through them, all like a continuous loop. The structure was both a comfort and a cage. You always knew what came next, but you also knew it would never truly end. Tuesday was baking day. Before dawn, the kitchen was already alive with the sound of flour being measured, dough being mixed, and wooden spoons scraping against heavy bowls. Bread was the staple of every household, and Tuesday meant producing enough to last several days. Dough was kneaded by hand, the rhythmic motion a test of endurance as much as skill, each batch requiring 30 minutes or more of pressing, folding, and stretching. Once shaped, the loaves were left to rise, their timing dictated by the warmth of the kitchen. The range, temperamental as always, demanded constant attention to ensure the bread baked evenly without scorching. By midday, the kitchen smelled of fresh bread, joined by the sweeter aroma of pastries and cakes destined for the family table. Wednesday often brought marketing if it wasn't needed more frequently. The cook and sometimes a maid would venture out to the markets, baskets in hand, to select the week's provisions. The day also marked silver polishing, a task that demanded patience and perfection. Candlesticks, serving platters and cutlery were scrubbed and buffed until every surface gleamed, reflecting the flicker of the kitchen lamps. Thursday was ironing day. The linens washed on Monday had dried and been collected, and now they had to be pressed to crisp perfection. Heavy flat irons were heated on the range, their weight making each stroke a strain on the arms. Tablecloths, napkins and clothing were smoothed over ironing boards, their sharp creases a testament to the care taken. The work was slow and meticulous, each fold and wrinkle requiring attention, the heat from the irons adding to the kitchen's oppressive warmth. Friday was for general cleaning, the deep scrubbing of corners and crevices not reached during daily cleaning. Carpets were beaten, curtains shaken out, and furniture polished. It was a day of dust and motion, of bending and scrubbing, of transforming neglected spaces back into pristine order. Saturday became a day of preparation. Sunday, even in service, was meant to be a day of rest, but rest required planning. Meals for the Sabbath were often prepared in advance, the work done on Saturday to ensure minimal labor the next day. The kitchen hummed with activity, dishes being assembled, vegetables chopped, and bread and pies set aside for Sunday's table. The rhythm of the week was unchanging. You knew what Tuesday felt like, what Thursday demanded, what Saturday required. Servants marked time not by dates but by these patterns. It must be Thursday. We're ironing, they would say, the repetition becoming a clock that never stopped ticking. The predictability was comforting in its way, but also oppressive. The cycle repeated endlessly, and no matter how much you worked, there was always more to do. But if weeks created rhythm, seasons created transformation. The work changed with the weather, and with those changes came the year's only real variety. Servant life in Victorian households was shaped by seasons as much as by the clock or calendar. The work itself changed with the weather, the demands of each season bringing its own forms of exhaustion and discomfort. Summer and winter in particular stood at stark extremes, each promising relief from the other but delivering only a different kind of hardship. In summer, the days stretched long, and with them, the hours of work. Natural light was cheaper than candles, so the household expected tasks to begin earlier and end later. The kitchen, already sweltering on an average day, became unbearable during heat waves. The range roared perpetually, and the air grew thick with steam and the smell of roasting meats and boiling water. Yet, summer also brought fresh produce, daily deliveries of strawberries, peas, tomatoes, and green beans. Meals were lighter, cold dishes more common, and the absence of heating fires made the kitchen slightly more tolerable. Occasionally, Mary and the other maids were sent to work in the yard or garden, a rare opportunity to breathe fresh air and escape the oppressive indoor heat, if only briefly. Winter, in contrast, shortened the days but made the work no less grueling. The range became the household's lifeline, burning hotter and longer to heat the house. This meant endless coal, carrying the black dust clinging to hands and clothes, its smoke irritating throats and lungs. The meals were heavier, roasts, puddings and stews, each requiring more preparation and time. The variety of available foods dwindled to root vegetables, preserved items and dried goods. Fresh fruit in winter was a luxury, An orange at Christmas a small miracle. While the kitchen was warm, the servants' quarters were not. At night, the unheated attic rooms turned into ice boxes, the damp air seeping through thin walls and into cold straw mattresses. Spring brought its own challenges with the tradition of spring cleaning, an exhaustive household, deep clean that left no surface untouched. Autumn, meanwhile, marked preserving season, when jams, pickles, and chutneys had to be made to carry the household through the winter. These tasks added layers of work onto the regular routines, filling the kitchen with the sweet, tangy smells of bubbling fruit and vinegar. The seasons were tracked not by dates but by the labor they imposed and the foods they brought. Strawberries meant June, game birds meant autumn, oranges meant Christmas. Time passed not in months but in strawberries, pheasants and oranges, markers of a world governed by harvests and weather. Summer promised relief from winter's cold but delivered heat that turned the kitchen into a furnace, while winter promised relief from summer's heat but delivered cold that turned the attic into an icebox. There was no season of comfort, only seasons of different discomfort. Having explored daily, weekly and seasonal rhythms, we turn now to special occasions. But beyond the daily, weekly and seasonal routines, there were moments rare, exhausting, carefully anticipated, when the household transformed and with it, the servants' work multiplied exponentially. Christmas in Victorian households was a season of splendor and indulgence, a time when families gathered to celebrate and feast, surrounded by decorations and traditions. But for the servants below stairs, it was a season of relentless labor, weeks of preparation leading to days of extraordinary effort. Christmas may have been magical for the family, but for the staff it was a test of endurance. The work began as early as November. Christmas puddings were mixed and steamed weeks in advance, wrapped tightly and left to age until the holiday. Preserves and mince pies were prepared, their rich, spiced scents filling the kitchen. Special ingredients were ordered, candied fruits, imported spices, fine wines, and sometimes extra staff were brought in to handle the workload. The house itself had to be cleaned thoroughly, every surface polished to a shine, before decorations were hung. Even the holly and ivy, so effortlessly draped along mantels and banisters, were placed by servants, under careful instruction. Christmas week was a whirlwind of activity. Roast goose or beef became the centerpiece of the meal, accompanied by elaborate desserts, rich gravies and special breads. The kitchen worked from dawn until long past dark, the range roaring, the air thick with the mingling aromas of roasting meat, baking pastries and simmering sauces. On Christmas Day itself, the servants rose before sunrise to begin preparing a meal that might take 20 hours to create, for a celebration that would last only 2. Yet, even amid the exhaustion, there were glimmers of joy. Servants traditionally received Christmas gifts from their employers, a small envelope of money, or perhaps fabric for a new dress. Christmas afternoon, after the family's meal and socializing, often granted servants a rare half-day holiday, one of only 2 or 3 days off in an entire year. The house quieted as the family rested, and the servants gathered in the kitchen for their own celebration. Leftovers from the grand meal, often still rich and plentiful, became their feast. Small gifts were exchanged, hand-knit scarves, small tokens bought with carefully saved pennies. Sometimes they sang carols or simply sat together, sharing rare moments of companionship and laughter. Christmas Day, she worked 20 hours to create 8 hours of celebration for others. And when those others finally slept, she and the other servants had 2 hours of something that resembled holiday before exhaustion claimed them too. Special occasions punctuated the year, but between them, the routine reasserted itself. Christmas passed, and January arrived, and with it, the same routine that had existed before and would exist forever after, or so it seemed to those who lived it. In the attic, where the poorest slept, sleep came not as a luxury, but as a necessity. A brief reprieve carved out of exhaustion. The straw mattress beneath Mary sagged under her weight, its uneven surface a far cry from comfort, but still it held her. Around her, the other kitchen maids lay on their own narrow beds, the room filled with the quiet rhythm of their breathing. The house above and below was silent, but it was a silence full of presence. the kind of silence that comes when tired bodies have nothing left to give. The night had its own sounds. The floorboards creaked faintly as the house settled into the cold. The wind pressed against the attic windows, rattling them softly in their frames. Distant church bells marked the passage of hours, each chime drifting faintly through the air. Somewhere below, a faint step creaked, a footman perhaps, finishing his duties, or a restless family member moving through the halls. But these sounds were distant, muted by the overwhelming quiet of the house. The most prominent sound was the breathing, slow, heavy, the unmistakable sound of people sleeping the sleep of exhaustion. This sleep was not peace. It was not the luxurious rest of those who had time to relax. It was simply absence, a shutting down of the body and mind, a state where unconsciousness replaced thought. The body took what it could in 4 or 5 hours, repairing itself as much as possible before the relentless cycle began again. It was deep and absolute, but not refreshing. Mary's muscles ached even in sleep, the pain sometimes pushing through the veil of unconsciousness. Dreams, if they came, were faint and fleeting, easily swallowed by the heaviness of her exhaustion. What did Mary dream of on the rare nights when dreams broke through? Did she dream of home, of fields and lanes she had not seen in years? Did she dream of a different life? One where her hands were not always raw, her back not always bent? Or did she dream of nothing at all, because even dreaming required energy her body no longer had? In the attic, sleep was not an escape. It was survival, the bare minimum her body demanded to face another day. The silence of the attic was different from the silence of empty rooms. It was full of presence, full of people too tired to stir, too worn to make sound. It was the silence of shared struggle, the silence of workers who had given everything they could, and now had nothing left but this brief necessary stillness. They slept because they must, and they woke because they must, and between sleeping and waking lived a life that history barely recorded, but a life that was lived nonetheless. A kitchen maid's life was defined by labour, but what came after? What became of the young girls who scrubbed floors, stirred pots, and climbed attic stairs in endless cycles? For some, service was a stepping stone to another life. For others, it was a lifelong sentence, the rhythm of their days unbroken until their bodies could no longer keep up. The paths varied, but the outcomes were rarely easy. The expected route for most kitchen maids was marriage. A woman in service might leave her position to marry a tradesman, a factory worker, or even another servant. These marriages offered escape from the grueling demands of service, but they often led to lives of continued labour, running a shop, managing a household, or raising children with little to no financial security. For those who didn't marry, advancing within service was the next best option. A kitchen maid with skill and determination might rise to become a cook, the queen of the kitchen, or even a housekeeper, a position of relative authority and comfort. Some aspired to be ladies' maids, attending to the personal needs of the mistress, though these roles required a different set of skills, including poise, discretion, and an understanding of fashion. But not every maid advanced or married. Many remained kitchen maids for decades, their bodies wearing down under the daily strain until age or injury forced them out of work. Others left service for different jobs, factory work, shop work, or, in the most desperate cases, prostitution. The options were few and grim. Women who left service often had no formal education, no savings, and no references beyond their years of labour. Without training in trades or access to opportunities, their prospects were bleak. For aging servants, the future was precarious. Some were fortunate. They worked for kind families who kept them on in reduced roles, allowing them to perform light duties in exchange for room and board. A few were given small pensions or cottages upon retirement, gestures of gratitude from employers who believed in loyalty. But these cases were exceptions, not the rule. Most aging servants faced dismissal when they became too slow or sick to work efficiently. Victorian society offered no safety net, no social security, no unemployment insurance, no welfare system. A servant unable to work relied on charity family, if they had one, or the dreaded workhouse, where paupers lived under harsh conditions, stripped of dignity and independence. The end of a lifetime in service was as unpredictable as the work itself. A maid's future depended less on her skill or effort than on the generosity of her employer, a generosity that was never guaranteed. A lifetime of service might end with a pension and a cottage, or it might end in a workhouse wearing pauper's clothes. The difference was as arbitrary as the whims of those who lived upstairs, but those futures were tomorrow's concern, and tomorrow's after that. Tonight, in this moment, Mary slept, and that was enough. The Victorian service system was more than a way of organising labour. It was an institution that shaped lives, defined class boundaries, and reinforced the social structures of an entire era. It was a system built on necessity, sustained by imbalance, and justified by the beliefs of the time. For over a century, it dominated the lives of the working class and the wealthy alike. At its heart, the system was economic. Wealthy families needed servants to maintain their lifestyles. The sprawling houses, the elaborate meals, the polished surfaces, the carefully manicured appearances. Poor families, in turn, needed wages to survive, and sending children into service became a way to secure both immediate income and a roof over their heads. A self-perpetuating system emerged, one that served the needs of both classes while exploiting the power imbalance between them. By the late 19th century, domestic service employed over 1.5 million people in Britain, making it the largest employment category after agriculture. The service system reinforced rigid class boundaries. Upstairs and downstairs were not just physical spaces, but social divisions, each defined by its own set of rules, expectations, and behaviours. Yet, paradoxically, service also provided limited upward mobility. A kitchen maid's daughter might rise to become a shop clerk or a secretary, a small but meaningful shift in status. For many, though, service was a trap rather than a stepping stone, a cycle difficult to escape without education, opportunity, or luck. The system's existence was justified by the cultural beliefs of the time. The natural order was a popular explanation. Some were born to lead, others to serve, and to challenge this was to challenge the very fabric of society. Religious teachings reinforced this idea, emphasizing humility, duty, and the virtue of serving others. Social theories about hierarchy and appropriate stations in life further reinforced the idea that service was right and proper. This justification allowed the system to persist unquestioned by many for decades. But service wasn't just exploitation. It was also dependence. Families relied on their servants not just for labour, but for stability, continuity, and the invisible work that kept their households functioning. Servants, in turn, relied on their employers for wages, food, and shelter. The relationship was unequal, but it was also deeply intertwined, creating a complex web of reliance and resentment. After World War I, the system began to decline. Women found new employment opportunities in factories and offices, and wealthy families could no longer afford large staffs. By the time World War II ended, the service system had largely disappeared, replaced by modern conveniences and a shifting social structure. The system required thousands to live small, constrained lives so that hundreds could live large, expansive ones. And everyone involved, from the wealthiest employer to the poorest maid, understood this was how the world worked. But history is made of days, not systems, and days are made of hours, and hours are made of moments. Like this one, where a tired girl sleeps in an attic and dreams nothing at all. The hour before dawn was the stillest of the night. The household lay silent, the world outside hushed, and the sky above lightened so slowly that the change was imperceptible to all but the stars fading one by one. In the attic, Mary slept deeply, her body using every second of rest to recover from yesterday's labour and to prepare for today's. The room was heavy with the sound of slow, exhausted breathing, a room full of people, yet each alone in their fatigue. This was the rhythm of her life, every day the same, every day different in small, almost invisible ways. Time was not measured in progress, but in repetition, in tasks completed and restarted, in moments that blurred together. The coming day would bring exactly what yesterday brought, and what tomorrow would bring as well. The same scraping of plates, the same soft hiss of water boiling on the range, the same ache in her back from hours spent standing, the same brief moments of stolen peace when the work allowed her to pause. In this world, hope was a quiet, fragile thing. It wasn't the hope of transformation or dramatic change. Such dreams had no place here. Instead, hope was found in small mercies, a kind word from the cook, a day without scolding, an employer's rare compliment, a Sunday afternoon walk in the fresh air, a letter from family, or the faint possibility that one day a future daughter might not need to enter service at all. These were the hopes that sustained her, the hopes she didn't dare speak aloud, but carried with her nonetheless. In the attic, the moment before waking was the most human of all. For that brief time, Mary was simply a person sleeping, not a servant, not a worker, not a position to be filled, but a human being at rest. Her body knew before her mind that it was time, a faint shift in muscles, a subtle tension returning. The last seconds of unconsciousness stretched, fragile and fleeting, and then the bells rang. Her eyes opened, the sound cutting through the silence, a sharp, undeniable call to begin again. For 30 seconds, she lay there motionless in the grey light of the attic, stealing the only thing she could, a moment, the only theft she would commit today. And then she rose because the work was waiting, and the work was always waiting, and somewhere below, a kitchen was preparing to come alive again.